my name is Federici, and I work with Period 3 and Unmatched Style. And I'm going to talk about symbols in interface design. But before I start, I kind of want to talk a little bit about myself, give you a little context from where I'm coming from. Because I didn't start out as a designer, I started out as a fine artist. And so I think that the way that I look at these things is a little different. But I've done a lot of conceptual art and really high detail painting, things like that over the years. And recently I teach at a collegiate level as well. And I teach illustration, drawing, and the way that I teach drawing is based upon two kind of primary concepts. One being symbolic drawing, sort of like the way that a child sees drawing or an untrained person sees drawing. And then representational drawing, which is what we kind of think of as being good, or like people with skill. But both systems have merit. And so when I became a designer and started working on interface stuff, it was really fascinating to me the way that certain symbols inherent to the web are ubiquitous, and we use them and take them for granted, and to some extent kind of abuse them because we as designers see them all the time, and we don't really, I don't know if we necessarily take the symbolic qualities of the things that we use to heart and as a tool. We think of user-centric design as being the only way to look at things, but I think that the symbolic nature of what we do is very powerful and can help us. So sort of the way that I'm talking about this is not to give you this is how you should do things or some specific mode or method of doing things, but rather to just kind of present some ideas from a person who has a completely different kind of background. So I had to pick a shorter name for that, but the talk is really a fun biennial name. And I'm going to kind of go through 4 specific things. They're all related. They're all related to user-centric design as well. But I'm going to talk about them in a little different way. So the first is symbolic imagery, in general. We'll talk about what it means. Then innate logic, which is the kind of logic that we apply to things we aren't necessarily trained to understand. Visual conventions that we use all the time and take totally for granted. And then the basic structural conventions, because these are also kind of conventions that we apply so that people can parse through our information and through our sites and navigate things intelligently, hopefully intelligently, to accomplish what they want to accomplish, and so that we can accomplish what we need to accomplish. So the first thing to talk about, just to get this out of the way, is talk about what is a symbol. And in a broad sense, it's something that represents something else, And generally, it's by convention, association, or resemblance. And what's especially important is this idea that it can be a material object that represents something abstract, because basically everything we do is some kind of illusion. You taught that a lot in fine art, that everything you do is an illusion. When you're creating some two-dimensional image, three-dimensional perspective, it's all an illusion. You have to create the idea that they can't see the illusion, they just see the thing that you're making. And so I think that that's kind of interesting. I think it applies here too, because there are abstract concepts that we use all the time, like text links, for instance, that our users don't understand, don't care about, but they need to accomplish some specific task, and they need to communicate the idea behind that task to them as they use it. So Carl Jung kind of attaches a caveat to that. It says that it's something that represents something which cannot be explained satisfactorily, and he's talking about his archetypes. But it makes sense for us too, because we don't get to necessarily train our users as they go in. There's a lot of research done about the way that people kind of approach things, and there was a paper called The Internationalization of Interface Design, and it talked a lot about the way Western users can use things, and they just go in and gung-ho, they don't read the manual, they just kind of do whatever the hell they want to. And so you have to accept the fact that a lot of people aren't going to go in and read your stuff until they get too stuck to deal with it. And if they get too stuck, then that's probably a problem on our end too. So the first site I want to show is automagical.com. This thing is freaking awesome. I love it. Because I just love the illustrative qualities to it. But the most interesting thing to me is that there is a distinct separation between the way that interactive elements are dealt with visually, and then the way design elements are dealt with visually. So you come to this site, and these little red circles and stuff, they're not visible until you hover. So it's sort of the hover state for the whole image. You can scroll, see the whole thing, but it's so engaging and visually impactful that you're immediately captivated by just the imagery. But you have no idea of like how to interact with it. So this hover state comes up, and it shows you all of these little buttons, right? And you can recognize them as buttons, and when you hover over them, they give you information on the product. So this is important in a couple different ways. One, there is a distinct separation between interactive and non-interactive elements. And it allows you to know, like, it just points out the places where you can click to get information. So you don't just start clicking all over the damn image trying to get something out of it, which happens a lot. I mean, how many of you guys seen heat maps where people just, like, find a word in a sentence and they click it because they want that to be the way that they get to something, you know? And that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about here, is they see a word, or they see an image, or they see a thing, and they think that it should be logically the way to get to the information about that specific thing. And we can communicate that really intelligently, easily, if we think about the way symbols are applied. So symbols in context. Context is really important because a symbol is defined by its environment. You know, what is the meaning of a particular symbol here is not necessarily the meaning of the country or something. So, you know, you look at the color red or something like that. There are symbolic significance here, but in other countries across the world, it means something totally different. So you have to be aware of that. In that same paper, the internationalization of interface design kind of like states that we suck at this, you know, at like paying attention to this. And so it's something to think about. Symbols have an implicit meaning that is extended by context. So that implicit meaning is kind of basically just whatever you assume it means. It's an assumption. So we as designers have assumptions, and so do users. And so that has to be taken into account. The context that we give it can kind of clarify what we're talking about. And so because it has so many multiple meanings, the hero has to be trained to understand that context. It has to be trained for each new context to understand what it means. So this is H4. And he kind of takes this using proprietary symbols to an extreme, where, you know, we see forced and flicker and dribble. But we know what those symbols are because we interface with the same companies. We know what their logos mean. So these are symbols that are designed specifically to represent a company or an organization. And that's kind of like a surface way of dealing with symbols, you know? And it's really cool. There's a symbolic nature to the way that they're organized. It's like this is my stuff. This is where it is. It comes out of my head. It's like shaking out of his hair, and it looks weird, so it's engaged. But when you start talking about just the actual like underlying abstract principles behind symbols, you start thinking about something a lot more simple. Don't get confused with something that's proprietary, like the logo for a company or something. Just take this, which is a symbol we use all the time to mean all kinds of things. If you put 5 of them in a row, it means this is the way that you're going to rate something. If you put it over a skyline, it means these are stars, and you need to think it's cute, or I failed or something. You put it on a vest, and it means badass, you know what I mean? It's like, it can mean whatever you want it to mean, right? It's like, so the context that you apply it, it adopts that meaning. And this is even culturally relevant too, you know what I mean? This image makes sense to all of us. It might not make sense to somebody from another country. So you always have to remember that. So then we'll take something that is symbolic in nature, a button on the web. And this format for buttons is really common. Gene is another guy that I work with. He talked about like microcopy. He showed a shit ton of buttons. I mean, sorry, he showed a lot of buttons. He showed a lot of buttons and the copy that was on them. But one of the things that he didn't talk about is like they just communicate so much just by the fact that it looks like a button. But you take this same thing and you put it in print. And it doesn't mean the same thing. We would see it as an illustration of a button. There's no associated meaning that it's an interactive object or that it's a path to get to somewhere or it accomplishes a task. So we have this like web language that's exclusive to us, or interactive language that's exclusive to us. So when we put something up like that, it means this is going to accomplish a task. This is going to take me to a new place. This is going to, you know, satisfy something that I need to happen. And one thing that was kind of interesting, a friend of mine was talking about, was that when this stuff is transitioning to print, it's kind of interesting that our language is moving out of our realm into other realms. And that can kind of be good for us because it can serve as a kind of training for our users. So they see print stuff all over the place, or, you know, because they see this button in print, they can make a direct connection between that brand or whatever it is to some element in your design, and it's like they know that that's the thing that's important. So Kenneth Burke is a philosopher. He talked a lot about the kind of connection between motivation and action. And he has this like kind of interesting quote. I mean, everything else he said is kind of like esoteric and really insanely hard to follow. But this is pretty simple. He says, you know, man is a symbol-making thing. We use them and we totally misuse them because we are so subjective about everything. You know, we take what is really a nice, specific language to our medium, and then we kind of like jump it up with whatever we want it to be. And so that to me is an indication that we're not taking into account this, you know, the specific nature of our medium and the way that the symbols are used in it. So this is a site, and I'll say that I actually like this site. It's really cool. It has like incredible texture in the background, which apparently I suck at making slides, so you can't see. But there are some things about it that I think are kind of indicative of what I'm talking about. Like for instance, there are contrast issues, so it's not as apparent here, but when you go to the website, that nav bar in the top, it just bleeds into some of the design elements that are in the back there, right? It just feels like another one of these things, and it loses some of its meaning as a nav element. But the thing that saves it is the structural symbol. We see this list of single words or a couple words in a row stacked on top of each other, and because of the structure of it, we identify it as a nav element. Right? And in other places, it's like pretty good. It's a fair distinction between spaces, and you know, it's fairly consistent in its use of color. But the thing that really like works for it in this case is that it just makes everything on the page blink. It all goes somewhere. It all does something. But sometimes you don't necessarily know what it's going to do. So we talk about like convention. We've mentioned this a little bit. So there's structural conventions, for instance. Just by placing something in a particular location on the page, it has meaning. And everything you do has meaning regardless of whether you mean it to or not. So understanding that meaning is really, really important. So just by putting something in a certain place, you can inform your users just because of the preponderance of that convention. Elemental conventions or something like this. And I kind of think this is the quintessential like web element. You know, text link. It's like, it's amazing to me. It's so fascinating to me about this, like, just this word right here, it means so many different things, right? Because it's underlined, it's different color, it means I'm interactive, you can click on me. And it says here, so it is actually a description of the fact that this is going to be a new location. So it tells your user, hey, you're going to go to a different place, and then the sentence as a whole informs you as to what that place is going to be. So just structuring your stuff intelligently can give them all the information they need, can essentially train them as to what this particular element is going to do. So, I mean, taking this stuff into account, I mean, even if you just think about how am I going to treat these things consistently across my page, so that every page that they go to, they know when they see this particular kind of symbol, it is going to do a specific thing. They know the context, they know how to use it. So this is, I think, a really good example, a simple example of kind of like how to make this distinction. Up in the top where it says work, there's, again, I started making slides apparently, but there's a horizontal nav bar, there's a sub-nav that is specific to the page, which is art, design, and her name. And those things are text-based, so you can tell that they're used for main navigation, and the way that this is treated is different. So there's a distinction between the two kinds of symbols used to represent navigation and then just linking to or like showing these particular gallery items. It also uses the convention of the grid-based alignment so that you can understand that these things are related. I mean, it's like all of the information that you get that's underneath the surface is what I'm talking about. This symbolic quality to just like distinguish between what I'm going to get out of clicking on this and what I'm going to get out of clicking on something like this. The thing that's even more fascinating to me about all this stuff is that we do this stuff intuitively. Like every good designer that you look at, it's not like they're not doing any of this stuff. You know, it's just that I don't think that there's a common language for it. We don't necessarily speak about symbols in this way, and it's really common for people to talk about this stuff in the fine arts world. And so it's like, I don't know. I just think it's an interesting way of looking at this. So we're basically talking about web-based graphic symbolism, which, you know, there's lots of graphic symbolism in print. You know, you walk around, it's everywhere, bathroom symbols, all that kind of stuff. They're used to communicate complex ideas with simple imagery. But what's kind of interesting about the web-based stuff is it's totally interactive. lots of stuff is interactive. If it's not interactive, it might as well just be an image. It doesn't do anything. And it's dynamic, so this stuff can change all the time. It's event-driven, which even if the users don't think about it, it's what it is. They click on something and it fires off an event. It has animation and time, and there are the specific technical limitations of the web. So it's like, it's the same principle, but applied to a different set of parameters. And this is what we normally use. We use this user-centered design paradigm. And it's concerned with the needs and wants of the end user. That's what we consider to be paramount. It requires market testing to really be effective, because you are going to make assumptions when you're designing. You have to test those assumptions. It's focused on creating the most satisfying user experience possible, while getting out of the way of the user and letting them do what they want. And it basically has like three components: information architecture, interaction design, and interface design. And so, like, the thing that I think that this symbolism kind of stuff is important for is this second thing right here: interaction design. Because interface design is, like specific qualities of what it's going to look like, but I'm talking about the symbolic level. So when you start talking about that, you can break it down to something called ecological design. Has anybody heard of that? Has anybody ever heard of ecological design? You have heard of it? Okay. Well, I found all this stuff doing research, but it's like ecological design was developed to help people deal with increasingly complex, like extremely complex scenarios in situations where training wasn't sufficient or wasn't even available, right? So you're basically thinking of the environment as the thing that you need to design, because it's like you want to basically train your user as they're using it, so that they can understand what to do, because they have goals, but you have goals as well. So the environment has its own set of goals. So it was originally developed to facilitate this complex system stuff, and it was actually like implemented first in nuclear power plants, which is amazing. You see these huge walls of dials and whatever, and readouts and all this kind of stuff. And like one of the main tenets of it is to decide what information is presented to the user, in what scenario, what is hidden from the user behind interaction or behind events. So we do this all the time. You create a website and you have links to other pages. You are hiding information from your user when you do that, right? Otherwise, it would all just be on one page. So, creating the paths to get through the information, creating the language that makes them understand what exactly the hell you're doing is really important. So it's broken down into a set of steps. And again, we kind of do this intuitively, but it's nice to see it kind of laid out as a set of ideas, discrete ideas. So you're going to determine the main goal of the site and then qualify that goal. You don't want to just say, like, I'm going to make a blog. Well, what's the point of the blog? What do you hope they're going to do when they go to the blog? Why is it there? What is the point of it? So you have to qualify that goal. Determine the limitations of the environment. I think these limitations kind of break down into two things. One is the technical limitations, and two, the limitations that you are going to impose on your user, right? Because no matter what you do, you are going to impose some kind of limitations. They have to click through this to get here. You're hiding this kind of information from them. You have to think about it to some extent in that way. Oops. Yeah. So I think this is a good example of that. There's launch list, and you know exactly what the goal of the site is, right? You go to it immediately, intuitively, you just know. It uses a set of symbols that are absolutely obvious. If there are text fields, it tells you what to put in those things. It's really descriptive. Even if you don't know what launch list is, you know what the site wants you to do, right? So that's what I'm talking about. And the next step is to determine the basic principles that will govern the interface, because you have to think about, like for instance, that Shmael Golden website where it had two kinds of interaction, one with these square graphics and one with text-based navigation. Those are the kind of basic principles that you're applying to it. And so if you're consistent, then you can make it a lot easier for them to understand. So this, I think, this is a really awesome site. And people may argue with me because it's very non-traditional in some ways. But it presents you with all of these squares. And it doesn't communicate necessarily that much, but it does kind of, because like these three at the top, they just have text, so it implies that they are links to text. Then the other ones have images, and they imply that there's a distinction between these two kind of interactions. One's going to give you images, one's going to give you text. And then when you click on one of them, it drops out and the things spread around and it reformats it around the new context. So I think this is really interesting because it tells you so much. If you click on one of these things, you basically know what's going to happen when you click on all of them, right? So that's that idea of like training your user as they interact with it. So the next thing is to determine how the small tasks will be accomplished. How the small tasks will be accomplished within the interface, because like if you want them to get from A to Z, there's all the steps in between. And all those little tiny interactions have to be considered, and they have to be distinguished, and they have to be understandable. And the last thing is to determine the visual hierarchy. And again, the thing that like is so important to me here is we all talk about this. Like we all talk about visual hierarchy and how we can use it to show the user what is the most important piece of information on the page. But we can also show them like what is the most important interactions on any page. Because we're going to have multiple kinds of interactions. We're going to distinguish between them in some way. And if we don't designate a specific and discrete visual hierarchy, there's going to exist one that we didn't intend. It's always going to be there. So you might as well be cognizant of what you're doing. So those are the basic steps, and I think that when you start talking about, just thinking about this stuff, I think that it can really change the way you consider, like how you're going to style buttons, how are you going to think about text links. Are you really going to not underline those things just because you think it's old or looks junky or whatever? Like maybe it's the language that people understand. So I just think that these are underlying principles that everybody can use, and they're not rules that you have to follow, but they're guidelines of just thought in general. So it's fascinating to me, I just thought I'd share that. So Kali is kind of like, I just think this site is amazing, right? Because it applies all of these ideas. I just think it's really, really amazing. The way that it distinguishes using really, really well-known conventions, all the conventions basically that you can think of, it applies all of these things intelligently. It has a refined and simplified language for people to understand. And it has only a few kinds of interactions to deal with. You have these like object interactions, and then you have like text-based interactions. And you can see how they differ. There's a communication effect they differ and what kind of content you get through. But the thing that really blows me away about this is that when people think about symbols, right, a lot of times they're thinking about that. They're thinking about the verb or the scarab or whatever. That's like supposed to mean something, and there's supposed to be something deep behind it. But you're not really actually using it that way. They're just cool ass little drawings. You know what I mean? And so there's this kind of inherent symbolism to them, but that's not what he's not using them to communicate content necessarily, right? What communicates it is the abstract symbolic qualities of these interactions. That's what's really cool about this. Is there's this distinction between just kind of like fun, entertaining symbolism, and then the logical kind of under the surface stuff that people may not necessarily like recognize consciously, but it works. It totally works. So that's me. Well, that's me. That's like my drawing. Find me there. We're gonna post this stuff up on Unmatched Style too, and I'll give a list of all my resources because I did a lot of research for this. There are a lot of really excellent papers out there that I don't think a lot of people are reading because they're maybe buried or they were intended for not web-based applications, but they're relevant. So we'll have that stuff up too. So that's it. Any questions? Thoughts? Yes?
What do you do?
Oh, I do web design. I do front-end design and illustration, concept design stuff. I do things like that. Any other questions? Yeah. Sure.
Have you done any kind of comparison test of what you do versus something that you don't approve of to give some kind of recognition and percentage-wise of the success of your approach?
Well, no. I'm like I said, I'm not doing this as like this is the way to do it. I'm just presenting like a new set of ideas that I've been finding as I research these subjects. I just think it's interesting to think about this stuff in a new way because user-centric design is basically proven. You know, it works to a very large extent. And I'm not presenting this as an alternative. I'm just presenting some of these ideas as just another thing to think about, something interesting that you can apply as well. Anybody else? Back there? Yeah, that's
just kind of comment on that saying, you kind of, I guess, lead into going back to user-centered design, where if you have this symbol and you know what intended to mean something, it's not immediately recognizable to the user. You have this half second, 1 second, 2 second delay before the user realizes what you're doing, and then.
That's actually exactly what I'm saying. Is that I think that most of us do that to a large extent, right? He basically asked whether, you know, I think that when people use unusual symbols or symbols that are not ubiquitous or not common or whatever, does it create this like barrier for the users? And the answer, in my opinion, is yes, it does. And that's what I'm kind of saying here, is that the more you understand the basic like abstract principles behind the elements that you're using, the easier it'll be to identify whether or not they are understood by your user in general. You know, because there's the reality that when people come to a website, you know, the vast majority of them have seen other websites before. And the first thing they see, the second thing they see, the first thing they see sets up a set of ideas, right? And then every subsequent thing they see just reinforces those things in their mind, right? So it's like, if you diverge like absolutely from that, you have to set up some kind of system that is innately like intuitive in and of itself. And that can be difficult, right? That can be difficult to create some new system for interaction that is intuitive just by looking at it or interacting with it just a few times. So I'm saying that there is power in the inherent set of symbols that we have. Text links, the shape of buttons, the layout of things, the location of them, all that stuff is important. That's basically what I'm saying. Anyone else? Yes?
I was going to ask how you see that affecting as we move to more and more touch devices. Because we're talking about the difference between print and that crossover, and then going as things become more touch device oriented. Obviously, the iPad being one of those touch devices.
Well, I think that one thing is that, like, you know, Apple is basically creating the well, I mean, it's arguable, but I think that Apple is basically setting the standard for that, right? And with the iPhone, and they do a really good job of homogenizing these symbols. You know, like there are specs on, like, you know, what certain things are supposed to be, how they're supposed to be styled, so that like the second if you follow that format, the second that somebody opens your app, they know exactly what to do. And you know, they're very explicit about it, and it's limited. But I think that it is an interesting approach, because it's basically taking this idea to its absolute conclusion and limiting it to that kind of interface. I don't think that it necessarily has to be that refined or anything. I don't actually, but. Yeah, all of this stuff is going to change, you know, because there's no, like basically there's no hover state on a touch screen, right? It just doesn't need to be one. So you're going to have to communicate that idea a little differently, you know. So yeah, I mean, I think that it will adjust a little bit, but I still think all the same abstract ideas apply. That's all. Yes.
Would you recommend any resources to get into deeper in interface design?
Yeah, there are a lot of papers that I read, and we'll put all of them up on. We'll do SlideShare and then unmatchedstyle.com. We'll put that stuff up there, and it's because it's a fairly extensive list. And I don't remember, like one of them that I remember off the top of my head is the internationalization of interface design, and I read a lot about that and some of the things that were related to it, but some of the other names don't strike my head. Yes.
Yeah, of course, it's doing interface design, and as a designer, how do you separate the concept of less is more and the concept of just including something there that makes it interesting?
Well,
sometimes as a designer, you get engrossed with what you think is nice, and you know what you think relative to what you think that other people might be able to.
Well, that's really the reason why I think it's important to have a set of like kind of discrete steps in what you're doing. You know, by kind of laying things out in such a way that, you know, you can say to yourself, you know, this is what I need to do first, this is what I need to do second. You can consider those like underlying things that are not necessarily have anything to do with your like kind of the pleasingness of your design, but have more to do with the interaction and the way that you communicate things. you know, regardless of text or something like that, you know? Because this is not a substitution for anything. Every other principle that you've ever learned has to be done as well. This is just another thing to consider. Anyone else?
Real quickly, jumping on your point about no hover state or even a down state, or I was probably down state on things, but I mean that's got to throw in a whole new perspective of how symbols are seen, or put more
Well, I just think that
weight
it basically it just changes. It's another environment. It's similar to the web, but it is a different environment. And we're gonna, as it exists longer, there are gonna crop up conventions that aren't necessarily exist here. You know what I mean? Like if there's no hover state or down state or whatever, something else is going to become, the prototype. And we just have to be able to identify it or control it to some extent, or just come up with multiple solutions that are equally valid. That's all. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Thanks.